My husband once told me, "From now on, I'll decide when we talk or spend time together. Stop chasing me like some desperate puppy." And then he said the words that changed everything. "Honestly, Sarah, I can't believe I ever lowered myself enough to marry you. You were never and will never be anywhere near my level." So I stopped. 2 weeks of complete silence later, he showed up at my workplace with roses, wanting back the woman he thought he'd broken. But I need to back up and explain how we arrived at that moment, because the cruelty of that Tuesday night in October didn't appear out of nowhere. It had been building for months in ways I kept making excuses for, explaining away each small cut until they accumulated into something I could no longer ignore. My husband Marcus said those exact words to me while I stood in our dining room wearing the dress I had chosen to celebrate my Social Worker of the Year award. He had come home 3 hours late to the special dinner I prepared, barely glanced at the table set with our wedding china and flickering candles, and delivered what he clearly considered an overdue correction to our marriage. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing that dinner with careful attention to every detail. The salmon was pan-seared exactly the way his mother had taught me during those early months of our marriage, when she still pretended I was good enough for her son. The asparagus was roasted with just the right amount of olive oil and sea salt. I had driven to 3 different stores to find the specific Cabernet he preferred, the kind that cost $45 a bottle and represented a significant portion of my weekly grocery budget. I set out the wedding china we kept in the cabinet for special occasions, pieces we had received as gifts 3 years earlier, from relatives who believed they were investing in a lasting marriage. The candles were the expensive kind that burned cleanly without smoking, arranged in the crystal holders we had registered for, but rarely used. This dinner was supposed to mean something. After 6 years of working as a social worker for the Department of Child and Family Services, pouring my heart into protecting children from abuse and neglect, helping families rebuild their lives from broken pieces, I had been selected as Social Worker of the Year for the entire state of Washington. The recognition came with a small bonus that I had already mentally allocated toward the student loans I was still paying off. The loans I had taken out to support us through Marcus's final year of law school when money was tight, and I worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. More than the money, the award represented validation that the work I did mattered, that the late-night emergency calls, the emotionally devastating cases, the children I fought to save from situations that would haunt me for years, all of it had been noticed and appreciated. I wanted to share that moment with my husband. I wanted Marcus to look at me the way he used to during our first year together, when he would introduce me at firm events with his hand on the small of my back and tell his colleagues I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. I wanted him to be proud of me the way I had been proud of him when he passed the bar exam, when he won his first major case, when the managing partners at Harrison and Associates started talking about him as partnership material, despite his relative youth. 6:30 came and went with no word from Marcus beyond a text at 5 saying he would be home by 6:30. I checked my phone repeatedly, watching the minutes accumulate into hours. 7 o'clock passed, then 8. The salmon was staying warm in the oven but losing its perfect texture. The asparagus was growing soft. The candles had burned down an inch. I texted him twice asking if everything was okay, if he was still planning to come home for dinner, and received no response to either message. By 9 o'clock, I had moved from worried to resigned. This was not the first time Marcus had been hours late without explanation or apology. Over the past 6 months, it had become a pattern I kept making excuses for. He was under tremendous pressure at work. The partnership review was consuming all his time and energy. Important clients needed attention at unpredictable hours. Big cases required late nights at the office. I told myself these things repeatedly, constructing elaborate justifications for behavior that deep down I knew was simply disrespect dressed up as professional obligation. When the door finally opened at 9:30, I stood up from the dining room table where I had been sitting in the dimming candlelight. My heart lifted briefly with irrational hope that maybe he would apologize, maybe he would notice the effort I had made. Maybe we could salvage something from this evening. Marcus walked in wearing one of his expensive Brooks Brothers suits, his tie already loosened around his neck, his attention fixed on his phone screen. He didn't look up as he entered. He didn't register the table set with our special china, or smell the dinner I had kept warm, or notice the candles still flickering. He just walked past the dining room toward his home office, his thumbs moving across his phone in that constant typing motion that had become more familiar to me than his touch. I moved quickly to intercept him, stepping into the hallway before he could disappear into his office and close the door. The words came out in a rush, bright and eager in a way that embarrasses me now when I remember it. I told him about the award, about being selected as Social Worker of the Year for the entire state, about the recognition ceremony that would happen next month at the state gala. My voice carried hope and excitement and a desperate need for him to care, to acknowledge this achievement, to show even the smallest sign that my accomplishments mattered to him. Marcus held up one hand without looking at me. That gesture, small and dismissive, was somehow worse than anything he said afterward. It was the way you would silence an interruption during an important phone call, the way you would wave off a server trying to refill your water glass when you were in the middle of a conversation that actually mattered. He stopped in the hallway and finally looked up from his phone, and I saw his face register not interest or pride, but irritation that I had delayed him from whatever he considered more important than this conversation. What he said next came out in the voice he probably used with opposing counsel when delivering bad news, clinical and precise, and utterly devoid of warmth. He told me we needed to establish some new ground rules for our marriage. The phrase sounded rehearsed, as if he had been planning this speech during his drive home, or perhaps for weeks before this moment. From now on, he would decide when we talked or spent time together. I needed to stop chasing him around, like a desperate puppy, begging for scraps of attention. It was exhausting, he said, and frankly beneath both of us. He paused there, and I watched him loosen his tie with one hand while the other still held his phone. He hadn't stopped looking at his screen even while telling me this, as if he couldn't spare his full attention even for the task of restructuring our marriage. Then came the part that would replay in my mind during every sleepless night that followed, the words that would define everything that came after. He said he couldn't believe he had ever lowered himself enough to marry me, that I was never, and would never be anywhere near his level. He laid it out with the precision of a lawyer presenting evidence. I was a social worker making $52,000 a year. He was about to make junior partner at one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in Seattle, with a salary that would be well over $180,000 at minimum, plus bonuses. We were not equals, he said, and he was tired of pretending we were. The comparison was delivered as fact rather than opinion, as if my worth as a human being could be accurately calculated by comparing our annual incomes and finding me catastrophically insufficient. Then he walked past me into his office and closed the door. The sound of that door clicking shut echoed through our home with terrible finality. I stood there in the hallway between the dining room and his office, unable to move, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Behind that closed door, I could hear the faint sound of his voice on a phone call, probably with a colleague or client, conducting business that mattered more than the wife he had just demolished. I walked slowly back to the dining room and looked at everything I had prepared. The salmon on our wedding china now cold and congealing, the asparagus that had lost its perfect texture, the expensive wine sitting opened on the table, the candles burning lower in their crystal holders. Everything looked different now, transformed by his words from a celebration into evidence of my foolish hope and fundamental inadequacy. This was what happened when someone who made $52,000 a year tried to pretend she deserved recognition or celebration or basic respect from someone about to make partner at a prestigious firm. I did not cry that night. That fact surprised me later when I had time to think about it, because tears would have been the natural response to having your husband tell you that marrying you was an act of lowering himself. But instead of grief or heartbreak, I felt something else arriving uninvited. It was cold and clear and merciless, like water freezing into ice or steel being forged in fire. The man I had married, the man whose last name I carried, the man I had supported through law school by working 2 jobs and taking out loans and sacrificing my own financial security, had just told me I would never be good enough, that my worth could be calculated on a spreadsheet comparing salaries and status, that our marriage was an act of charity on his part rather than a partnership between equals. I stood in that dining room staring at the closed office door, and I made a decision. If Marcus wanted silence, if he wanted to decide when we communicated, if he truly believed I was so far beneath him that our marriage represented him lowering himself, then I would give him exactly what he asked for. I would honor his request with such perfect compliance that he would eventually realize the catastrophic error he had made. I would respect his boundaries so thoroughly that he would come to understand what his life actually looked like without the invisible support system I had been providing for 3 years. I moved through the dining room like someone performing a familiar ritual for the last time. I cleared the table and wrapped the uneaten salmon in foil. placing it in the refrigerator where it would sit untouched until I threw it away days later. I blew out the candles and watched the thin streams of smoke rise toward the ceiling. I put away the wedding china piece by piece, wondering if we would ever use it again and already knowing the answer. I picked up the bottle of expensive Cabernet and poured it down the kitchen sink, watching the dark liquid swirl away, $45 disappearing down the drain as a fitting symbol for the evening and perhaps for our entire marriage. Then I walked upstairs to the guest room and closed that door, creating my own boundary in response to his. Sleep did not come that night, but planning did. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, and I began to think through what came next with surprising clarity. Despite the shock still reverberating through my system, Marcus had just handed me something valuable without realizing it. He had given me permission to stop trying, permission to stop walking on eggshells, permission to stop being the only person in our marriage who seemed to care whether it survived. He had declared the rules of engagement, and I would follow those rules with such perfect obedience that he would eventually understand what he had lost. The next morning, I woke before dawn and moved through our home with new purpose. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, but only 1 cup. I prepared breakfast, but only enough for 1 person. When Marcus emerged from our bedroom around 7, still adjusting his cufflinks and checking his phone, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked confused. The confusion was brief, but visible. For 3 years, I had made his breakfast every morning without fail. His egg white omelet with precisely chopped vegetables, his whole wheat toast, his coffee prepared exactly how he liked it, with 1 sugar and a splash of cream. The routine had been so consistent that he had stopped thinking about it, had come to expect it the way you expect electricity to work when you flip a switch. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and my own simple breakfast, and I looked at him calmly. I told him I assumed he would prefer to handle his own meals going forward, since he was so capable, and I was apparently so far beneath his standards that my service was no longer required. The words came out politely, with no trace of anger or sarcasm, and that seemed to confuse him even more than the absence of breakfast. Marcus opened his mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it. He grabbed his briefcase from the counter, where I would normally have placed it, along with his dry cleaning receipt, and a reminder about whatever he had asked me to handle that day. None of those things were there now. He stood for a moment looking around the kitchen, as if searching for something he couldn't quite identify, then headed toward the door. I watched him leave without offering the kiss goodbye that had once been automatic, without reminding him about his afternoon meeting, or asking what time he would be home. For dinner, the door closed behind him, and I sat alone in the kitchen with my coffee, feeling the silence settle around me. That silence no longer felt uncomfortable or tense. Instead, it felt full of possibility. It felt like freedom. That first day of my strategic withdrawal turned out to be harder than I had anticipated, though not for the reasons I expected. I didn't miss Marcus. I didn't feel lonely or sad or regretful about the decision I had made to give him exactly the silence he demanded. What proved difficult was breaking 3 years of carefully constructed habits that had become as automatic as breathing. My body had learned to operate a certain way, and now I was asking it to unlearn everything. I sat at my desk during morning break while my colleagues discussed cases in the conference room. My phone lay on the desk beside my case files, and I caught my hand reaching for it without conscious thought. My thumb moved toward the screen to open my messages. Muscle. Memory preparing to type out the usual text, asking Marcus how his morning was going, or whether he needed me to pick up anything on my way home. I stopped myself just before touching the screen and pulled my hand back as if the phone had suddenly become hot. This happened again during lunch, and again during my afternoon home visit. Each time I had to actively override the impulse that had been reinforced daily for 3 years. I decided to redirect that energy somewhere else. I picked up my phone and texted my sister Rachel instead, asking if she wanted to have dinner sometime that week. We hadn't spent quality time together in months, because I always seemed to have something I needed to do for Marcus. Rachel responded almost immediately with enthusiasm and 3 exclamation points, saying she had been worried about me and would love to catch up. Then I messaged my friend Lisa, who I had been neglecting because Marcus always seemed to need something during the evening hours when I might have maintained friendships. Lisa wrote back saying she thought I had forgotten she existed, and suggesting we meet for drinks Friday after work. I even responded to an email from Jennifer, a colleague from another department whose lunch invitations I had declined at least 6 times over the past year, because I always rushed home to make sure Marcus had a proper dinner waiting. When I finally walked into the break room that afternoon carrying my lunch, Jennifer looked up from her salad with genuine surprise. She had been sitting alone at one of the small round tables, reviewing case notes while she ate, and her face brightened when she saw me. I asked if I could join her, and she immediately moved her stack of files to make room. We talked about nothing particularly important. Jennifer told me about the vacation to Portland she was planning for spring break, showing me photos on her phone of the boutique hotel where she had booked a room. She complained about a difficult case she was handling with a mother who refused to acknowledge her boyfriend's abuse of her children. She shared her thoughts on the new department director's questionable policy changes regarding caseload distribution. I realized as we talked that I had missed this simple conversation with another adult about topics that had nothing to do with managing Marcus's needs or anticipating his moods or making sure his life ran smoothly. Jennifer asked me how my week was going, and I found myself telling her about my Social Worker of the Year award. Her reaction was everything Marcus's should have been. She grabbed my arm and actually squealed with excitement, saying I absolutely deserved the recognition, and she had always thought I was one of the best social workers in the department. We spent the rest of lunch discussing the upcoming ceremony, and what I should wear, and whether I would give a speech. When our break ended, and we had to return to our desks, I felt lighter somehow, as if the simple act of being seen and celebrated by someone who genuinely cared had released pressure I didn't know I had been carrying. By day 3, something shifted in a way I hadn't expected. I woke up that morning and went through my routine of showering and getting dressed and preparing for work, and somewhere around the time I was brushing my teeth, I realized I hadn't thought about Marcus even once. I hadn't wondered what time he would be home. I hadn't mentally reviewed his schedule to anticipate what he might need from me. I hadn't checked my phone to see if he had sent any messages overnight. The realization stopped me mid-motion with my toothbrush still in my mouth. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus was not the background program constantly running in my mind. At work that day, I handled a particularly difficult case with complete focus. A 7-year-old girl had been removed from her home after her stepfather's violence escalated to the point where she had been hospitalized. I sat with her in the interview room, helping her feel safe enough to tell me what had happened, and I was fully present in that moment, rather than distracted by thoughts of what I needed to do for Marcus later. During my lunch break, I helped mediate a conflict between 2 colleagues who were disagreeing about how to handle a shared case. I approached it with patience and clarity, instead of the distracted efficiency I had been operating with for months. I planned the following week's home visits, without once checking my phone to see if Marcus had texted. The mental space that had been consumed by managing his requirements was suddenly available for other things. I felt physically lighter, as if I had been carrying a heavy backpack for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to walk without that weight pressing down on my shoulders. During my lunch with Jennifer, I actually tasted my food instead of eating mechanically, while part of my brain was already planning dinner. I noticed the flavor of the apple slices I had packed, the texture of the sandwich bread, the cold sweetness of the iced tea I had brought from home. Jennifer noticed the change before I fully recognized it myself. She tilted her head while watching me and said I seemed different somehow. Lighter was the word she used. She asked if something good had happened, and I told her I was just making some life adjustments. She didn't push for details, but she smiled at me with the knowing expression of someone who understood that sometimes the best changes come from finally letting go of things that were weighing you down. The transformation accelerated with each passing day after that, gathering momentum like a stone rolling downhill. I started going to the gym before work, something I had abandoned during my marriage because Marcus used to complain that I was never home in the mornings. The complaint had never made sense because he left for work before 6 and wouldn't have noticed my absence. Anyway, but I had stopped going because the criticism made me feel guilty. Now I reclaimed that morning routine. I drove to the gym at 5:30 and spent 45 minutes on the treadmill and weight machines, and I arrived at work feeling energized rather than drained. I reconnected with old friends I had let drift away over the past 3 years. Lisa and I met for drinks on Friday evening at a wine bar in Capitol Hill, and we talked for 3 hours without me once checking my phone to see if Marcus needed anything. My college friend Amanda invited me to a weekend brunch, and I accepted without the automatic calculation of whether Marcus might want me around that day. These friendships had been neglected, because Marcus always seemed to need something during the hours I might have spent maintaining connections outside our marriage. I hadn't fully realized how isolated I had become until I started rebuilding those bridges. On Wednesday evening of my second week, I did something I had been wanting to do for years. I signed up for a pottery class at the Pottery Northwest studio in the University District. The class met every Wednesday from 6 to 8, time I would normally have spent preparing elaborate dinners that Marcus barely acknowledged. I walked into the studio feeling nervous and excited, and I was greeted by Margaret, the instructor. She looked to be in her mid-60s with short silver hair and clay permanently embedded under her fingernails. She had the kind of face that suggested she had lived through difficult things and emerged stronger. Margaret welcomed me with genuine warmth and showed me to a pottery wheel in the corner. She demonstrated how to center clay on the wheel, her hands moving with practiced confidence. I tried to copy her movements, but my first attempt was a disaster that collapsed into a misshapen lump within seconds. Margaret laughed kindly and told me everyone started there. She said learning pottery required patience and willingness to fail repeatedly before anything good emerged. Then she shared something personal. She had been teaching pottery for 20 years, she said, after her second divorce forced her to rebuild her life from scratch. She had needed something that was entirely hers, something nobody could criticize or diminish or take away. Pottery became that thing for her. She looked at me with eyes that seemed to see more than I had said, and she told me that sometimes the best things we create come from the rubble of what we thought we wanted. Her words settled over me like a blessing. I worked the clay for the rest of that class, and while nothing I made was remotely presentable, I felt something shift inside me. I was building something new from the ruins of my marriage, and it would be entirely mine. On day 7, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. During my lunch break, I drove to a bank across town where Marcus would never have reason to go. I walked into the building with my heart pounding and asked to speak with someone about opening a new account. The banker who helped me was a young woman who looked fresh out of college. She walked me through the paperwork with professional efficiency, never asking why I wanted an account separate from any joint finances. I opened a checking account in only my name and authorized the bank to set up automatic transfers from my paycheck, small amounts that Marcus would never notice missing. I was building a financial safety net that existed entirely outside his knowledge or control. That same week, I scheduled a consultation with a divorce attorney. I found Patricia Hartwell through an online search for lawyers specializing in high-asset divorces, where one spouse had significantly higher income. Her office was downtown in a high-rise building near Pike Place Market that smelled like expensive leather and quiet power. Patricia listened to my story with the focused intensity of a predator calculating exactly how much my husband was going to pay for his arrogance. She took notes in precise handwriting and asked detailed questions. She wanted to know about our finances, about the student loans I had taken out to support us through Marcus's law school years, about the 2 jobs I had worked while he studied for the bar exam. Patricia told me that in Washington State, his upcoming partnership and the significant salary increase that came with it would be considered marital property subject to division, especially since I had financially supported his education and early career. When she smiled at this information, it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly how to make Marcus regret every cruel word he had said to me. I left her office with a plan and a timeline, and for the first time since that terrible Tuesday night, I felt something like hope. The changes in Marcus became visible around day 10, subtle at first, but accumulating into something I could no longer ignore even if I had wanted to. I started noticing things during those brief moments when our paths crossed in the house we still technically shared. He would emerge from the bedroom in the morning looking disoriented, moving through the kitchen with the confused energy of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. I could hear him opening cabinets and closing them again, the sounds punctuated by long pauses that suggested he was trying to remember where things were supposed to be, or perhaps wondering why they were no longer where he expected them. His favorite coffee mug sat unused in the cabinet. For 3 years, that mug had been waiting for him every morning, filled with coffee prepared exactly how he liked it, 1 sugar and a splash of cream, the temperature still hot but not scalding. Now it gathered dust while I used my own mug and made only enough coffee for myself. I would stand at the counter preparing my breakfast and watch him in my peripheral vision as he opened the cabinet, saw the empty mug, and closed the cabinet again without taking it out. He never asked me to make his coffee. He never even mentioned the absence of this routine we had maintained for so long. But I could see the confusion in his posture, the way he stood there for a few extra seconds, as if waiting for something to materialize that no longer would. The dry cleaning situation provided another source of visible bewilderment. Every Thursday for 3 years, I had picked up his dress, shirts and suits from the cleaner on my way home from work. The timing worked perfectly, because the cleaner was between my office and our house, and Marcus always had evening meetings or court appearances that required freshly pressed clothing. Now his dress shirts hung in the cleaner's storage area with yellow tickets attached, unclaimed because I no longer considered his wardrobe maintenance part of my responsibilities. On Thursday evening of the second week, I heard him on the phone with the cleaner asking about his order, his voice carrying irritation mixed with confusion about why his clothes hadn't been picked up as usual. The kitchen told its own story of deterioration. The groceries I used to purchase and organize according to his preferences were gone, replaced by items I wanted to eat without any regard for his tastes. I bought the snacks I liked, the breakfast foods that were easy to prepare for one person, the ingredients for simple meals I could make quickly after work. Marcus would open the refrigerator and stand there staring at the contents as if the items inside were written in a language he couldn't read. He was looking for the prepared meals I used to have waiting, the ingredients for his favorite dishes, the specific brand of Greek yogurt he preferred. None of it was there anymore. I would walk past him during these moments of confusion without offering help or asking if he needed anything. I maintained the pleasant but distant demeanor you might use. With a roommate you barely knew, rather than a husband you had shared a bed with for 3 years, when our paths crossed in the hallway, I smiled politely and continued to wherever I was going. When we were both in the kitchen at the same time, I prepared my food and ate it without engaging in conversation beyond basic pleasantries about the weather or reminding him that trash day was Thursday. One evening, near the end of that second week, Marcus actually broke the silence I had been maintaining. So carefully. I was sitting in the living room reading a thriller I had picked up at the library. A story about a woman who systematically destroyed her abusive ex-husband's life through careful planning and patient execution. Marcus came out of his office around 8 and stood in the doorway watching me for a moment before speaking. His voice, when he finally asked if everything was okay, carried a hint of uncertainty I had never heard before. It was tentative, almost vulnerable, completely, unlike the confident attorney voice he used for everything else. I looked up from my book and smiled at him with the same pleasant distance I had been maintaining since that terrible Tuesday night. I told him everything was fine. I was just respecting his boundaries and giving him the space he had requested. I reminded him that he had said he would decide when we talked or spent time together, so I was simply waiting for him to decide. The logic was perfect and airtight. How could he possibly complain that I was giving him exactly what he had demanded? He stood there for a moment longer, as if trying to find a flaw in my reasoning. His mouth opened slightly as if to say something, then closed again. Finally, he just nodded and went back into his office. I returned to my book and felt a small surge of satisfaction. The trap I had set was working exactly as intended. Day 12 brought a new development that told me my strategy was having the desired effect. My phone rang during lunch. While I was sitting in the break room with Jennifer and 2 other colleagues. We were discussing an upcoming training seminar on trauma-informed care for foster children, debating whether the new protocols would actually improve outcomes or just create more paperwork. When Marcus's name appeared on my screen, I glanced at it briefly and declined the call without interrupting the conversation. I went back to my sandwich and continued talking about the training logistics, as if nothing had happened. Jennifer caught my eye and raised her eyebrows slightly, but she didn't say anything. She knew enough about my situation to understand what that declined call represented, and the look she gave me was one of approval, rather than concern. After lunch, as we walked back to our desks, she squeezed my arm and told me I was doing great. She didn't elaborate, and she didn't need to. That evening, my phone rang again while I was at pottery class. My hands were covered in wet clay, working on a bowl that was actually starting to look like something Margaret might not be embarrassed to display. I glanced at the screen and saw Marcus's name. Without breaking my concentration on the clay, I returned my attention to the wheel and kept working. Margaret noticed the phone call and my decision to ignore it. She gave me an approving nod, the kind of acknowledgement that passes between women who understand what it takes to ignore a ringing phone when you've spent years jumping to answer every call, dropping everything to accommodate someone else's needs. Over the next 2 days, Marcus called 6 more times. I answered none of them. Each ignored call felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself that I had given away without realizing the transaction was happening. Wednesday afternoon, Thursday morning, Thursday evening, Friday at noon, Friday evening, Saturday morning. The calls kept coming, and I kept declining them with increasing satisfaction. I wasn't being vindictive or cruel. I was simply following the rules he had established. He would decide when we communicated, and apparently, he hadn't yet decided. On day 14, the calls stopped, and the text messages began. The first one arrived during my afternoon home visit with a foster family. It was brief and polite, asking if I was okay. I read it, and put my phone back in my bag without responding. The second message came an hour later, expressing confusion about why I wasn't answering his calls or texts. The third message that evening carried a different tone, frustration bleeding through the carefully worded sentences. He said he didn't understand what was happening, that we needed to talk, that my silence was making things worse. I read each message as it arrived and deleted it without responding. What could I possibly say that wouldn't undermine the perfect logic of my position? He had told me to stop bothering him, so I had stopped. He had said he would decide when we communicated, so I was waiting for him to decide. The fact that his attempts to initiate contact didn't count as deciding was a nuance he apparently hadn't considered when establishing his rules. By the end of the second week, the physical evidence of Marcus's deterioration became impossible to ignore. He had stopped eating regular meals, something I could deduce from the takeout containers accumulating in the kitchen trash, Thai food containers, pizza boxes, Chinese food cartons, fast food bags. The man who used to insist on proper home-cooked dinners every night was apparently living on whatever he could order for delivery. His dress shirts were fitting looser around his collar and shoulders, visible evidence that he was losing weight from stress and irregular eating. The dark circles under his eyes told their own story. He wasn't sleeping well, probably lying awake at night, wondering how his perfectly planned life had suddenly spiraled out of his control. I knew he was up at odd hours because I could hear him, pacing in his office at 3 a.m, the floorboards creaking under his restless movement. Sometimes I would hear the sound of his voice talking on the phone at hours when no reasonable business call would be taking place. His carefully maintained appearance, always so important to him as he cultivated the image of a successful attorney destined for partnership, was showing cracks. I noticed a coffee stain on his tie one morning, a small imperfection he never would have tolerated when I was managing the details of his life. His hair looked uncombed more often than not. His jaw frequently showed stubble that suggested he had skipped shaving. His expensive leather shoes had lost their polish. The man who had told me I would never be on his level was discovering what his level actually looked like without the invisible support system I had been providing for 3 years. Every small detail I had managed, every task I had handled without being asked, every convenience I had arranged to make his life run smoothly, had disappeared. And watching him struggle with the basic maintenance of his own existence brought me a satisfaction I hadn't anticipated feeling. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted because he had always underestimated me, was that I had been documenting everything. While he was falling apart trying to manage his own life, I was building an airtight case for why our marriage had failed and who bore responsibility for that failure. I kept a detailed journal recording every dismissive comment, every time he prioritized his career over our relationship, every instance of casual cruelty. The journal sat in my car where he would never find it, pages filling with evidence written in my own hand. I had copies of our financial records downloaded onto a thumb drive that Patricia had told me to keep somewhere safe. The records showed clearly how much of my income had gone toward supporting his advancement, while my own student loans remained largely unpaid. I had screenshots of text messages where he canceled plans with one-line excuses. I had emails where he dismissed my concerns as unimportant compared to his work obligations. I even had a recording from our last attempted marriage counseling session, the one he had refused to attend, where the therapist noted his absence in her official records. Patricia had reviewed all of it with the thoroughness of an attorney preparing for war, rather than a simple divorce. She assured me it demonstrated a clear pattern of behavior that would play very well in court, especially given that his partnership was about to make him significantly wealthier. The revenge I was building was not hot and impulsive. It was cold and methodical, constructed with the same careful attention I gave to everything else I did well. Day 15 arrived as a Friday afternoon filled with the usual end-of-week energy that social services offices carry. My colleagues were wrapping up cases before the weekend, and I was in my office organizing files for the following week when Jennifer's voice came over my desk phone. She asked me to come to the reception area, and the request carried an unusual quality that made my pulse quicken. There was something in her tone that suggested this wasn't routine. My mind immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios as I walked down the hallway. Had something happened to my parents? Was my sister Rachel okay? The corridors were lined with awareness. Posters about child safety and foster care resources that normally brought me comfort, but now seemed to blur past as I walked faster. When I reached the reception area, I looked through the glass windows before entering and felt my breath catch in my throat. Marcus stood in the lobby wearing one of his expensive Brooks Brothers suits, the charcoal gray one he saved for important client meetings. In his hands, he held an enormous bouquet of roses that must have included at least 3 dozen stems, wrapped in cellophane with an elaborate bow. He looked completely out of place among the chaos that surrounded him. Clients were waiting to meet with caseworkers, creating the usual controlled disorder of children playing in the corner, forms being filled out, and conversations happening at multiple volume levels. Marcus stood in the middle of this organized mess, looking lost and desperate. Jennifer sat behind the reception desk, and when she caught my eye, her expression communicated volumes without words. There was sympathy there, certainly, but also curiosity about what exactly was unfolding in her lobby and what I intended to do about it. I saw other staff members trying not to stare too obviously while absolutely watching this scene develop. My colleague David from the foster care unit was pretending to check his mailbox, but had clearly stopped moving. Karen, the department director, had paused in the hallway just outside the reception area, with a stack of folders in her arms. I took a deep breath and felt something settle over me. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was certainly part of the mixture. It was more like clarity combined with purpose. I straightened my shoulders in a gesture that felt like putting on armor, and I walked into the lobby with calm confidence. Marcus's face when he saw me transformed immediately. Relief flooded his features, followed quickly by desperate hope. He took a step toward me, and I noticed that his carefully maintained appearance showed signs of strain. His suit was immaculate as always, but his face looked haggard. The dark circles under his eyes were more pronounced than they had been even a few days earlier. He had lost weight in a way that made his collar seem slightly too large. He started talking before I could say anything, words tumbling out in an uncharacteristic rush. Marcus made his living crafting perfect arguments and maintaining complete control in high-stakes negotiations. But right now, he sounded like someone who had lost his script and was improvising badly. He said he had been trying to reach me for days. He said he had been calling and texting and didn't understand why I wasn't responding. He held out the roses toward me like they were a peace offering that would somehow reset everything between us. He explained that he had been under tremendous stress with the partnership review. He said he might have said some things he didn't really mean. He suggested we go to dinner that evening at the Walrus and the Carpenter, the seafood restaurant I used to love. We hadn't been there in over a year because Marcus was always too busy, but apparently now he had time. He talked about reconnecting and working through our problems, and how much he missed me. He said he missed us, as if we had been a functioning partnership, rather than a one-sided arrangement where I gave everything, and he took it as his due. The performance was desperate and transparent. I could see the calculation. Behind his words, the attorney's mind trying to find the right combination of phrases that would compel me to respond the way he wanted. But I also saw something else. I saw genuine confusion about why his usual tactics weren't working. Marcus was accustomed to winning arguments through logic and persistence. He expected that showing up with expensive flowers and the right words would solve this problem the way he solved every other problem in his life. I stood there looking at him while the lobby around us grew progressively quieter. Several staff members had stopped what they were doing entirely and were now watching with open fascination. Jennifer had abandoned all pretense of working and was staring at the drama unfolding in her lobby with her reading glasses pushed up on her head. A group of 5 or 6 clients waiting for appointments had gone silent, sensing with the intuitive awareness people have that something important was happening, even if they couldn't understand exactly what. When I finally spoke, my voice carried clearly through the lobby. I was surprised by how calm I sounded, how steady. I told Marcus that he had established very clear ground rules for our marriage 2 weeks ago. He had said he would decide when we talked or spent time together. He had told me to stop chasing him. What was happening right now was not him deciding we should talk. This was him deciding he wanted to talk, which was entirely different. I explained that he wanted me to be available on demand, to come running the moment he experienced even mild discomfort from the consequences of his own choices. I told him that wasn't how this worked anymore. My voice remained calm and measured, but every word was deliberate. I wasn't being emotional or vindictive. I was simply following the logical conclusion of the rules he had established. Marcus blinked at me, and I watched genuine confusion cross his features. In his world, people didn't tell him no. Opposing counsel might argue their positions, but eventually negotiations happened and compromises were reached. Clients might have concerns, but Marcus convinced them to trust his judgment. His world operated on the assumption that with the right approach, any problem could be solved, and any person could be persuaded. But I was refusing to be persuaded, and he didn't have a framework for understanding why his performance was failing. His confusion quickly transformed into anger. I could see the shift happen in his posture and his expression. His jaw tightened. His voice, when he spoke again, carried an edge that made several of the watching clients take a step back. He said I was his wife, and the way he said it suggested this fact alone should compel my obedience. He said I couldn't just ignore him for 2 weeks like he didn't exist. He called what I was doing manipulative and said it constituted emotional abuse. The accusation was so absurd that I actually laughed. The sound surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise him. It wasn't a bitter laugh or a cruel one. It was genuine amusement at the complete lack of self-awareness he was displaying. Here was a man who had told me I would never be on his level, who had called marrying me an act of lowering himself, who had demanded I stop bothering him and wait silently until he decided he wanted my attention. And now he was standing in my workplace accusing me of emotional abuse because I had given him exactly what he demanded. I told him I was following his instructions perfectly. He had requested that I stop chasing him, so I stopped. He had established that he would determine when we communicated, so I was waiting for him to determine that. He had told me I would never be on his level, and that he had lowered himself by marrying me, so I was respecting his superior judgment by maintaining appropriate distance. The logic was airtight, and I delivered it with the same calm precision he had used when restructuring our marriage 2 weeks earlier. Several staff members were now watching openly without any pretense of doing anything else. David had given up checking his mailbox entirely and was standing with his arms crossed. I saw Karen emerge fully into the lobby, her expression suggesting she was prepared to intervene if this situation escalated to something requiring administrative action. But I also noticed something else in her eyes. It looked almost like approval of how I was handling this confrontation. Marcus stood there, holding his wilting roses, and I could see him trying to find some angle, some argument, some way to regain control of a situation that had slipped entirely beyond his management. His voice changed, dropping to something almost pleading, a tone I had never heard from him in 3 years of marriage. He asked what I wanted from him. The question itself revealed how little he understood about what was happening. This wasn't a negotiation where I had demands that could be met. This wasn't a contract. Dispute where the right offer would bring me back to the table. He started offering concessions like he was in a deposition. He called himself an idiot. He admitted he'd been stressed and taken it out on me. He acknowledged he'd said things he shouldn't have said. Each admission came out carefully worded, and I could see him watching my face for signs that his strategy was working. I looked at him standing there, and I realized something profound. I wasn't looking at the man I had fallen in love with 3 years earlier. I was looking at a stranger who happened to wear his face. The word that came out of my mouth was simple and revolutionary. No, not an explanation or a justification or an apology for saying it. I told him I wasn't going to dinner with him. We weren't going to talk. I was going to finish my work week and go home to my apartment. I made sure to emphasize that last part. My apartment, not our house. My apartment that I had found and rented without his input or permission. I explained that I would enjoy a peaceful weekend without walking on eggshells or wondering if my very existence was annoying him. I suggested he leave the office, return to his firm, and start getting used to what his life looked like without me managing every detail of it. The information about the apartment hit Marcus with visible force. He actually took a step backward, as if I had pushed him. He repeated the words back to me, "Your apartment," like a question, even though I hadn't phrased it as, one. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion gave way to disbelief, which transformed into something approaching panic. He started protesting immediately. "We lived together," he said. "I was his wife. I couldn't just move out without discussing it with him first." He was invoking the marital contract as if it was a binding legal document that obligated my presence regardless of how he had treated me. His legalistic mind, so accustomed to controlling situations, through contractual language and procedural authority, couldn't comprehend that some things exist outside the realm of negotiation and compliance. I told him to watch me. Then I turned and walked away down the hallway toward my office. My practical work shoes made soft sounds on the polished floor. Behind me, I heard him call my name. His voice carried a note of genuine panic that was completely unlike his usual controlled attorney tone. He was beginning to understand the full scope of what he had lost, and the realization was clearly overwhelming his ability to maintain composure. But I didn't turn around. I didn't acknowledge his plea. I didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing he had gotten any reaction from me beyond the calm dismissal he deserved. I just kept walking until I reached my office door. I went inside and closed it behind me, and I stood there for a moment with my back against the door, feeling my heart pounding from the confrontation. The office was quiet now. My desk was covered with case files representing children and families who needed my help, people whose lives would be genuinely improved by the work I did. My Social Worker of the Year award sat on the shelf where I had placed it 2 weeks earlier after the state ceremony I had attended alone. Marcus had been too busy to come, he'd said, though I suspected the truth was that he simply didn't care enough to rearrange his schedule. The plaque was modest but meaningful. It represented recognition that the work I did mattered, that the hours I invested in protecting vulnerable children had been noticed and valued. I sat down at my desk and took several deep breaths. The adrenaline from the confrontation was beginning to fade, replaced by something steadier and more sustainable. It felt like peace, or at least the beginning of peace, the first tentative notes of a song I was learning to sing after years of silence. That weekend, I met with Patricia in her downtown office. She had asked me to come in on Saturday morning to finalize our strategy. Her office building was mostly empty on weekends, our footsteps echoing in the marble lobby as I made my way to the elevators. Patricia was already at her desk when I arrived, surrounded by folders and legal documents, a cup of Starbucks coffee steaming beside her laptop. She laid out the timeline for what came next, with the precision of a general planning a military campaign. By Monday morning, divorce papers would be delivered to Marcus's law office at Harrison & Associates. Patricia had specifically selected the process server for this task, a man who specialized in maximizing the public nature of such deliveries. Marcus's colleagues would witness him receiving divorce papers at work, creating exactly the kind of visible disruption that law firms found distasteful. By Tuesday, I would change my phone number. Patricia had already arranged for a new number through a carrier account that Marcus couldn't access or trace. I would block Marcus on every social media platform, severing the digital connections that still theoretically existed between us. By Wednesday, I would meet with a realtor Patricia recommended to discuss selling our house in Capitol Hill, the one I had made into a home while Marcus had merely used as a place to sleep and work and ignore me. By Friday, I would sign the lease on the one-bedroom loft in Pioneer Square, the space in the renovated historic building with exposed brick walls and large windows that let in beautiful natural light. The apartment would be entirely mine, with no memories of Marcus contaminating it. Patricia reviewed the financial documentation I had gathered over the past 2 weeks. She examined the bank statements, showing how much of my income had gone toward supporting Marcus's advancement. She studied the student loan documents, proving I had taken on significant debt to cover our living expenses while he attended law school. She reviewed the employment records, showing I had worked 2 jobs during his final year of law school and his bar exam preparation. She smiled when she finished reviewing everything, and it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of an attorney who knew exactly how to make an opponent pay for their arrogance. She told me that Marcus's impending partnership, which he had used as justification for treating me like hired help beneath his status, would actually work in my favor during asset division. Since I had supported him through law school and the early years of his career when he was earning nothing, I was entitled to a significant portion of his increased earning potential. Patricia estimated I would walk away with enough money to pay off my student loans completely and have a substantial financial cushion for whatever came next. The satisfaction I felt hearing this had nothing to do with the money itself. It was about justice. It was about Marcus finally paying a price for the way he had treated me. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for early November, the kind of day that feels like a gift before winter settles in. I went through my workday with a focus I hadn't experienced in months. I handled a crisis with a teenage foster placement, mediating between the girl and her temporary family with patience and skill. At 11:30, my phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. The message contained only one word: delivered. I excused myself from my desk for a moment, stepping into the empty conference room where I could take a breath without colleagues watching my reaction. The divorce papers had been served to Marcus at his office. Patricia had arranged for the process server to arrive during mid-morning when the office would be at its busiest. Maximum witness count, she had explained during our Saturday meeting. Marcus would open that envelope in front of his colleagues and the managing partners who were deciding his future at the firm. I imagined his face when he saw the legal documents formally ending our marriage. The careful corporate composure he worked so hard to maintain would crack in front of the people whose opinions he valued most. The thought brought me satisfaction that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with justice. He had humiliated me in private. Now he would experience a fraction of that humiliation in the professional setting he cared about more than anything else. 3 weeks after I served divorce papers, Marcus showed up at my new apartment on a Saturday morning. I had been unpacking the last boxes from my move, organizing my small kitchen with the dishes and utensils that were mine alone, when I heard the knock on my door. I looked through the peephole and felt my stomach tighten when I saw him standing in the hallway. He was holding 2 coffee cups from Zeitgeist Coffee, the expensive cafe we used to visit during our first year of marriage when he still made romantic gestures. He looked terrible in a way that went beyond simple tiredness. His expensive suit hung differently on his frame, suggesting he had lost more weight. The dark circles under his eyes had deepened into something that looked almost bruised. I opened the door but didn't step aside to let him enter. I stood in the doorway, blocking access to my apartment, this space that represented freedom and new beginnings and a life he wasn't invited into. He launched into what was clearly a prepared speech. He said he had been wrong, that the partnership pressure had made him say terrible things he didn't actually mean. He told me he had started going to therapy to work on his issues with stress and communication. He said he understood now how much I had done for him, how much he had taken for granted. He wanted to prove he could be the husband I deserved. He said he was willing to do whatever it took to fix this. I listened to his entire speech with the patience of someone who no longer had any emotional investment in the outcome. Then I asked him the question that had been forming in my mind since my conversation with his sister Jennifer. I asked if he was trying to reconcile because he actually wanted to be married to me, or because his managing partners had suggested that going through a messy divorce right before his partnership decision might reflect poorly on his judgment and stability. The way his face changed told me everything I needed to know before he even attempted to answer. There was a flicker of surprise that I had figured this out, followed immediately by careful neutrality, as his attorney brain tried to formulate a response that wouldn't confirm my suspicion. He tried to deny it, saying of course he wanted me back because he loved me and realized what he had lost. But his delivery completely lacked conviction. His eyes wouldn't quite meet mine, instead looking at a point somewhere over my left shoulder. I told him I had already discussed this possibility with Patricia. She had explained to me how law firms often viewed personal chaos as evidence of poor decision-making that might extend to professional matters. His sudden interest in reconciliation, coming exactly 3 weeks after receiving divorce papers, and at precisely the time when partnership decisions were being finalized, seemed like remarkably convenient timing. I watched him realize that I had seen through his performance completely, that the woman he had dismissed as too simple and low status to match his level had actually been several steps ahead of him throughout this entire process. I took a breath and told him something I had been thinking about for weeks. He had been right about one thing, I said. We weren't on the same level, but he had gotten the hierarchy completely backwards. I explained that I spent my days protecting children from abuse and neglect, rebuilding shattered families, and creating safe futures for the most vulnerable members of our society. I shaped lives and made actual contributions that would ripple forward through generations in ways neither of us could fully measure. Every child I saved from an abusive home would have opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. Every family I helped reunify had a chance at healing. Every time I advocated in court for a child's best interests, I was creating adults who might break cycles of trauma. Marcus, on the other hand, spent his days helping wealthy corporations find legal loopholes to avoid paying taxes and maximize profits regardless of social cost. His work paid extraordinarily well, yes, but it created no real value for anyone except his clients and his firm. He helped the already wealthy become more wealthy. He helped powerful entities avoid their social responsibilities. That was what his prestigious partnership would allow him to do more of. I said my level was just fine. I was proud of my level, and I had no interest in descending to his level, where human worth was calculated purely by salary and status, where love was transactional and conditional. where marriage was something you stayed in only when the optics benefited your career advancement. I told him the divorce would proceed exactly as planned. Patricia had assured me the settlement would be substantial, given that his partnership and the significant salary increase it brought would be considered marital property. I had supported him through law school by working 2 jobs and taking out loans that I was still paying off. I had facilitated his career advancement by managing every aspect of his personal life so he could focus entirely on professional success. Under Washington state law, I was entitled to a significant portion of his increased earning potential. Marcus's face went through several expressions as I spoke. Shock gave way to something that looked like anger, which then transformed into what I can only describe as defeat. Then I closed the door. I stood there with my back against it for a moment, holding the expensive coffee he had brought me. Then I walked to my kitchen sink and poured it out. I didn't need his coffee or his apologies or his belated attempts at reconciliation. 4 months later, the legal process concluded in a conference room at Patricia's office. Marcus and I sat on opposite sides of a polished table, signing documents that formally ended our marriage. His attorney was present, a sharp woman who had clearly counseled him not to fight this battle. I signed each document with my maiden name that I had already begun using again. The settlement was exactly what Patricia had predicted. Enough money to pay off all my student loans completely, a substantial portion of Marcus's partnership bonus, half the equity in our house. When it was finished, I gathered my copies of the paperwork. Patricia walked me to the elevator, and as we waited, she told me she wished all her clients handled their divorces with the same strategic clarity I had demonstrated. The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside. I descended to the lobby and walked out into afternoon sunlight that felt warmer than it should have for late winter. 6 months after the divorce finalized, I sat in my apartment on a Saturday morning with coffee made exactly how I liked it, strong and black. My apartment had become fully mine. The handmade pottery from Margaret's classes filled the open shelves. My books were arranged in an order that made sense only to me. I had kept working at the same department. If anything, my colleagues now treated me with additional warmth and respect. My caseload remained challenging, but I poured energy into my work that had previously been diverted into managing Marcus's needs. I had reconnected with old friends and made new ones through my pottery class and the book club Jennifer had invited me to join. My sister Rachel had become one of my closest confidants, our relationship deepening now that I no longer had to pretend everything was fine. Lisa called me one evening in early spring with news she had heard through the legal community. The partnership Marcus had treated as inevitable had been deferred for at least another year. The managing partners had cited concerns about his judgment and stability during what they described as a personally difficult period. I felt no satisfaction from this news, which surprised me. I had imagined I would enjoy knowing his actions had cost him professionally, but sitting in my apartment listening to Lisa share this information, I felt only a distant sense that justice had been served in ways I hadn't orchestrated. I told Lisa I appreciated her sharing the information, but that I was ready to stop tracking Marcus's life and focus entirely on building my own. She understood immediately what I meant. The real revenge was simpler and more profound. The revenge was peace. Waking up each morning without anxiety about what mood I would find. Going through my days without walking on eggshells. Coming home to silence that felt welcoming rather than tense. The revenge was choosing myself after spending 3 years choosing someone else, understanding that I had always been exactly the right size, exactly the right level, exactly enough, and that Marcus's inability to see that reflected his deficiency, rather than mine. I was a social worker who protected vulnerable children and rebuilt shattered families. That was enough. That had always been enough. And if Marcus ever figured out what he had lost, the woman who had loved him unconditionally before he taught her that some people don't deserve unconditional love, it would be far too late. The woman he tried to diminish had turned out to be stronger than he ever imagined. She had walked away with her dignity intact, and her future bright with possibility, and she was drinking her coffee exactly how she liked it, in an apartment that was entirely hers, on a Saturday morning that belonged to no one but herself. This story of calculated revenge and reclaimed power should resonate deeply with anyone who's ever been told they weren't enough. If you believe that no one should be told they're beneath their partner's level, please consider subscribing and sharing this story. What was your favorite moment of Sarah's journey? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories of strength and justice like this one. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.